Strait of Hormuz is 21 miles wide at its narrowest point, 21 miles through which approximately 20% of the world's traded oil passes every day. Close the strait and the breathing of the global economy stops. Not gradually, immediately. The Iranian military had understood this arithmetic since before the revolution and had invested in the specific categories of weapon that make a narrow waterway into a defended barrier, anti-ship missiles, and naval mines. The combination is what strategists call a layered denial architecture and what tanker captains call a threat they are paid not to think about. The facility that the target folder described was not a launch complex and not a mine-laying depot in the traditional sense of either term. It was an integrated storage and preparation facility, a hardened underground complex at the naval base infrastructure southwest of Bandar Abbas that housed both the anti-ship missile systems allocated to the Strait Denial mission and the naval mine inventory that would be deployed into the Strait's shipping lanes in the opening phase of any regional confrontation. The integration of both categories under a single hardened roof reflected a doctrine whose logic was sequential. The mines go first, seeding the shipping lanes with contact, influence, and pressure-sensitive weapons that force the tanker traffic to stop and the clearing forces to begin a mine countermeasures operation that takes weeks. While the clearing operation is underway, the anti-ship missiles hold the clearing forces at risk, making the mine countermeasures mission a hazardous one rather than a methodical one, extending the timeline, extending the economic disruption, and extending the period during which Iranian leverage over the global energy market is at its maximum. The two weapon categories were not alternatives. They were a system. Storing them together reflected the understanding that their operational effectiveness derived from their coordination. The target folder had been built over 3 years from collection whose complexity reflected the challenge that an active naval base presents. Dense equipment and personnel movement whose military significant signals require months of baseline characterization to identify. The Bandar Abbas baseline was established. Underground construction signatures were identified 14 months in. The facility's layout was established through acoustic monitoring from strait sensor arrays, thermal imaging characterizing underground ventilation patterns, and human intelligence. When the folder was complete, it contained chamber depths and dimensions, inventory estimates for both weapon categories, and the access tunnel routing connecting the underground facility to the pier infrastructure and coastal launcher road network. The depth was 44 meters, shallower than most previous targets in the series, a consequence of the coastal geology at Bandar Abbas. The Gulf Coast Formation in this region is predominantly carbonate rock, whose karstification, the dissolution and fracturing that centuries of groundwater movement through limestone produces, creates a substrate whose penetration characteristics are more variable than the consolidated formations of the interior. Karst limestone is not uniform. It contains voids, fracture zones, and density variations whose distribution cannot be fully characterized from surface collection. The weapons engineers who worked the fuzing solution had approached the karstification problem by widening the confidence interval on the detonation depth estimate and designing the algorithm to recognize karstification signatures in the deceleration data, signatures that would allow it to distinguish between a fracture zone, which should be penetrated, and an air void, which should trigger a depth adjustment calculation. The algorithm had been tested against karst samples. The engineers assessed it at 81% confidence. The wider interval was the karstification penalty. 19% was document. The mission was authorized. The operational significance was the timeline compression. Iranian naval mines are manufactured domestically at an estimated 60 to 90 units per year. Anti-ship missile replacement required procurement channels that sanctions had made expensive and slow. Destroying both set back the straight denial capability by 3 to 5 years for mines and 2 to 4 years for missiles, numbers that drove the targeting decision because the regional tension assessment had been placing the operational timeline for a straight confrontation in months, not years. The difference between a confrontation with a full straight denial capability and one with a depleted capability was, in the naval planner's calculus, the difference between a crisis and a catastrophe. The mission architecture was a single B-2 Spirit carrying 2 GBU-57 massive ordnance penetrators configured for the karst limestone fuzing algorithm on 2 aim points that addressed the facility's 2 primary storage chambers. The missile storage chamber and the mine storage chamber were separated by 67 meters within the underground complex, connected by an internal transit corridor whose width and construction the human intelligence had established as sufficient to transmit the overpressure from either weapon's detonation to the other chamber at a level the engineers had modeled as contributing to but not independently sufficient for the other chamber's elimination. Both chambers required a direct weapon. The aircraft would make 2 passes on diverging headings with a planned interval of 58 seconds between releases. The B-2 lifted off at 11:31 p.m., 8 hours and 43 minutes to Bandar Abbas, shorter than most missions in the series. The pilot noted the brevity and did not allow it to alter his preparation protocols. Brief sorties produce a specific complacency risk, not the gradual erosion that long flights cause, but the underestimation of difficulty that shorter profiles invite. He prepared as though the sortie were 20 hours. The preparation was sufficient. The tanker contact at 2:44 a.m. completed in 16 minutes over the Central Gulf. Conditions were calm. The transfer was unremarkable. The pilot noted it as unremarkable in his mental log and continued. The Bandar Abbas defense architecture was denser at low altitudes, protecting pier areas and fuel infrastructure from maritime attack helicopters and low-altitude strike aircraft, and thinner at the higher altitudes where the base's planning had invested less. The B-2 flew high. The thin high-altitude coverage came from an S-300 battery 8 kilometers north, oriented toward northern and western land-based approaches. Its southern coverage, the B-2's approach direction from over the Gulf, was its least sensitive sector. The Growler package was sized against the least sensitive sector regardless, treating favorable geometry as margin rather than sufficiency. The inner ring included 2 Tor M1 batteries covering eastern and western approaches, and a Pantsir S1 on the southern waterfront facing the strait. The Pantsir was positioned to engage low-flying maritime threats, an aspect that placed it in the least favorable geometry for detecting the B-2's high-altitude approach. A system designed to look down at water-skimming threats does not look up at high-altitude stealth aircraft with the same sensitivity. The Pantsir was in the EW allocation. Its geometry was additional margin on top of the coverage. At 7:19 a.m. local time, 33 minutes before the planned initial point, the EW package activated against the Bandar Abbas defense network. The S-300 battery to the north received its suppression from the Growler flight operating from the carrier group in the Gulf of Oman. The inner ring systems received their suppression from the land-based EW asset at the Gulf Partner Airfield. The activation produced the Iranian air defense response that the planning had modeled. The S-300 operators began frequency management cycling within 90 seconds. The Tor M1 batteries elevated their scan rates in response to the anomalous jamming environment they were observing. And the base's Sector Alert Controller issued an awareness notification to all organic defense systems at 7:21 a.m. Not an active alert, but the elevated monitoring posture that sustained multi-band jamming, without an associated contact report warranted by Iranian doctrine. The awareness notification elevated the Pantsir S-1 on the southern waterfront from its routine scan mode to its maximum sensitivity search configuration. Maximum sensitivity in the Pantsir's search mode increased the probability of detecting a low cross-section target above the noise floor in a jammed environment. The system's designers had intended this configuration specifically for scenarios where a threat might be present but not yet confirmed. The configuration also increased the system's susceptibility to jamming artifacts. Higher sensitivity means lower noise floor, which means more returns above the noise floor, which means more operator judgment calls about which returns are real and which are interference. The Pantsir operator at the southern waterfront was experienced. He had been in the system for 6 years. He knew the difference between jamming artifacts and developing contacts in a jammed environment, and he applied that knowledge with the discipline of someone who had made the distinction correctly more times than he had made it incorrectly. At 7:38 a.m., the Pantsir produced a return at 31% detection confidence on a bearing that the operator recognized as consistent with a high-altitude approach from the south. He assessed it as a probable artifact. The confidence level was below his personal reporting threshold, which sat above the system's automated reporting threshold, reflecting his experience with the specific signature that Gulf-facing jamming produced in this system's maximum sensitivity mode. He did not report it. He watched the next sweep. The next sweep returned nothing. The operator noted the absence and continued his scan. At 7:41 a.m., 3 minutes after the first return, the Pantsir produced 2 consecutive returns, 28% and 34%, on a bearing that differed from the first return by 4 degrees. The displacement between the first return's bearing and the second set's bearing was not consistent with a single moving target maintaining a constant heading. It was consistent either with 2 separate artifacts on adjacent bearings or with a target that had altered course by 4 degrees in the 3-minute interval between the first and second contacts. The operator looked at the 2 sweep sequence. He looked at the bearing displacement. He picked up his reporting channel and transmitted a non-standard contact report to the sector controller. 2 below-threshold returns on adjacent bearings, 3-minute interval from a prior single return on the original bearing, assessed as probable artifact, requesting sector awareness. The sector controller received the non-standard report at 7:41 a.m. and 44 seconds, an operator he trusted, an anomalous bearing displacement, a sustained jamming environment. A naval base his threat assessment had flagged as high priority in any American strike campaign. He upgraded the sector to active alert at 7:42 a.m. and directed all systems to activate fire control radars. The fire control radar activations reached the B-2's passive warning receiver within 4 seconds of the directive reaching the batteries. The mission commanders saw the display populate with active fire control emitters across the bearing arc that included the base, both Tor M1 batteries, the Pantsir, and the S-300 in the northern sector. The S-300's fire control activation was the most significant. The battery was in its least sensitive aspect, but an active fire control radar searching in its least sensitive aspect was qualitatively different from a search radar operating in that aspect. He was 19 minutes and 40 seconds from the first initial point. He transmitted the full suppression code to the Growler architecture. The full suppression code activated the reserve power allocation, Additional budget drawn from secondary frequency coverage, concentrating maximum output on active fire control radars. The S-300's fire control frequency received maximum output within 6 seconds. Its picture degraded. 2 frequency shifts attempted, both followed within modeled response latency, until the second shift produced 3 clean sweeps before the 8-second follow-on response caught up. The 3 clean sweeps produced returns. The first sweep returned to contact at 22%. The second returned 39%. The third returned 47%, rising confidence across 3 consecutive sweeps. 22, 39, 47. The S-300's fire control tracking processor generated a confirmed track symbol at 7:44 a.m. and 11 seconds. 47% was below the battery's autonomous engagement threshold, but a confirmed 3-sweep rising track crossed the threshold for fire control authorization request. The battery's engagement controller transmitted the authorization request to his supervisor at 7:44 a.m. and 19 seconds. The supervisor received the request at 7:44 a.m. and 23 seconds. He had a 3-sweep rising confidence track on a bearing from the south in a sector his battery was not optimized to cover, in a heavy jamming environment with a maximum confidence level of 47%. His doctrine was specific about 3-sweep rising tracks below autonomous threshold. Supervisor authorization was required and was expected to be granted when the track's bearing and behavior were consistent with a threat vector and no alternative explanation for the track had been established. He granted the authorization at 7:44 a.m. and 31 seconds. The S-300 launched 2 missiles at 7:44 a.m. and 38 seconds. The mission commander saw the S-300 uplink signatures go active at 7:44 a.m. and 39 seconds. He ran the intercept geometry. S-300 missiles flying toward the position computed from 3 rising confidence returns in a partially jammed environment. Partial jamming meant range ambiguity, better than a single return solution, but not the precise triangulation a clean picture produces. A solution bracket rather than a precise intercept point. The B-2's actual position was inside the bracket. The S-300's lethal radius was smaller than the bracket. Whether the aircraft was inside the lethal radius or between the bracket's center and its edge was a function of the specific range error, a number he did not have. He held course. The release point was 16 minutes ahead. He held course. The Growler's maximum output reached the S-300's uplink frequency at 7:44 a.m. and 51 seconds, 12 seconds after launch. 12 seconds of uncontested uplink guidance had given the missiles their initial trajectory. The jamming that arrived at second 12 degraded the continuous guidance updates that the uplink provided for terminal correction. The missiles flew on their last corrected trajectory. The range ambiguity in the fire control solution had placed the trajectory's impact point at the center of the solution bracket. The B-2's actual position was 1,100 meters from the bracket center. Inside the bracket, but outside the S-300 missile's lethal radius at that offset. Both missiles detonated at 7:45 a.m. and 14 seconds against atmosphere that the aircraft had occupied 1,100 meters previously. The pressure signatures reached the airframe as the low-frequency vibration that near-miss detonations produce at altitude. The pilot noted it in the same register he noted everything at this phase of the flight. Present, assessed, filed. The aircraft continued. The initial point was at 8:03 a.m. The bay doors opened. The karst limestone algorithm was active in the weapon's fusing system, calibrated, validated, loaded. The first GBU-57 released toward the missile storage chamber's subsurface coordinate at 44 meters in the coastal formation. The aircraft corrected and turned to the second heading. The weapon's descent into the Bandar Abbas karst produced the variable deceleration profile the algorithm had been developed for. At 9 meters, a fracture zone, recognized by its characteristic deceleration reduction as the weapon entered lower density fractured rock. The algorithm noted the fracture zone and adjusted its depth estimate upward by the amount the fracture zone's density deficit implied. At 17 meters, the fracture zone ended, and the deceleration returned to the baseline carbonate density. Adjustment confirmed. Depth estimate recalibrated. At 29 meters, an air void, not the small void of a fracture zone, but a karst dissolution cavity, whose size the seismic survey had not been able to characterize at the resolution required to distinguish a small void from a larger one. The deceleration dropped sharply, faster than the fracture zone pattern, consistent with an air void rather than fractured rock. The algorithm recognized the void signature and initiated the void crossing calculation. The void had to be traversed before the depth estimate could be resumed, and the depth estimate during the void traversal used the void entry depth plus the void's estimated extent as the reference. The void's estimated extent was computed from the deceleration profile at the moment of entry, a calculation that required 0.008 seconds, and that produced an estimated void width of 2.3 meters. The algorithm added 2.3 meters to the traversal count and waited for the deceleration to return to carbonate baseline. The deceleration returned to baseline at 31.8 meters, consistent with the 2.3-meter void estimate within the algorithm's tolerance. The algorithm resumed its standard depth count. The fuse threshold was met at 42 meters, 2 meters above the design detonation point, within the widened confidence interval that the karstification penalty had established. 2 meters above design depth in karst limestone, with the missile storage chamber ceiling at 44 meters, place the detonation 2 meters above the ceiling in intact carbonate rock, 2 meters of carbonate above a chamber ceiling. The kill mechanism analysis had modeled this outcome as the lower bound of acceptable. The overpressure, transmitted through 2 meters of intact carbonate, would reach the chamber at a level sufficient to destroy the contents if the contents were at the median of the intelligence estimate's specification range and at the lower bound if they were at the upper end of the range. The missile systems in the storage chamber were assessed from the intelligence estimate as consistent with median specification. The 2-meter shortfall was within the tolerance the mission planners had accepted when they authorized the mission against an 81% confidence fusing solution in karst geology. The chamber contents were eliminated. The second weapon released at 8:04 a.m. and 1 second, 58 seconds after the first, as the planning had required. Its aim point was the mine storage chamber, 67 meters from the missile chamber, in a portion of the karst formation whose seismic characterization had showed a cleaner density profile than the area above the missile chamber. The cleaner profile proved accurate. The second weapon's descent encountered one fracture zone at 13 meters, recognized and adjusted for, and no air voids through the remainder of the penetration sequence. The fuse threshold was met at 43 meters, 1 meter above the designed aim point, within the tighter end of the confidence interval that the cleaner formation had permitted. The detonation was inside the mine storage chamber rather than above it. The naval mine stored inside. The contact mines, the influence mines, the bottom mines in their pressure-resistant containers, the mine cases and mooring systems and initiator assemblies that together represented the inventory the intelligence had assessed, experienced the overpressure at direct contact geometry. Direct contact was not a function of the specification range. The mine storage chamber was eliminated comprehensively. The connecting corridor between the two chambers transmitted the combined energy of both detonations through the underground facility in the sequence that the planning had modeled as contributing to comprehensive destruction without independently constituting it. The access tunnels that connected the facility to the pier infrastructure and the coastal launcher road network suffered structural damage at their internal junction points. The facility's internal transit capability was compromised. The pier infrastructure itself was undamaged. The weapons had been aimed precisely enough to confine their effects to the underground storage complex without producing surface damage that would have required a different operational and diplomatic calculus. At 8:05 a.m., the monitoring network registered simultaneous seismic alarms from both storage sections. The duty officer attempted contact. Missile storage, silence. Mine storage, one terminal active on emergency power, then silence 11 seconds in. Emergency protocol activated at 8:07 a.m. The base commander received the notification at 8:09 a.m. An active sector alert since 7:42 a.m. An unconfirmed S-300 engagement with no intercept confirmation, and now simultaneous loss of contact with both storage sections. He understood the relationship between those four pieces of information. He transmitted his report at 8:13 a.m. while the B-2 was already past the strait and 300 miles into its egress. The numbers that closed the package: 8 hours and 43 minutes of flight time. 2 GBU-57 massive ordnance penetrators employed in a 58-second interval on diverging headings. 1 karst void at 29 meters requiring and 0.008-second in-flight void crossing calculation, estimated at 2.3 meters, actual traversal, consistent with that estimate within tolerance. First weapon detonated 2 meters above design depth. Within the karst confidence interval, missile storage chamber eliminated at median specification. Second weapon detonated 1 meter above design depth. Mine storage chamber eliminated at direct contact geometry. 3 rising confidence S-300 sweeps, 22, 39, 47%, producing a confirmed track and a 2-missile salvo that detonated 1,100 meters from the aircraft's actual position. 1 experienced Pantsir operator whose below-threshold contact report to the sector controller, honest about the bearing displacement he did not understand, triggered the active alert that produced the S-300 engagement. His honesty about what he did not understand had almost been more dangerous than a confident wrong report would have been. 0 aircraft lost. Both storage chambers eliminated. The straight denial architecture that the Iranian naval planning had been building for 4 decades lost its primary integrated storage and preparation facility in 58 seconds. A 21-mile waterway can be made impassable by mines you cannot see and missiles you cannot outrun, if you have the infrastructure to deploy them. Remove the infrastructure, and the plans remain. Plans without inventory are intentions. The strait remains. What was stored to close it does not.